Now, as we've seen when we looked at that ideological scheme, all of these sources of injury are going to start by affecting cell function. It might affect all the cells in your body. Okay? Hyperthermia is going to affect all the cells in your body. Right? Hyperkalemia is going to affect all the cells in your body. Or some injuries are just going to affect one tissue-specific set of cells. Right? So the hepatitis virus specifically infects liver cells. Okay? But one way or another, it's going to start off by causing cell injury and affecting cell function. Okay? And when you affect the cell function, you affect all the layers of organization above that. Okay? When cell function declines or becomes altered, it alters tissue function, organ function, and full body systems function. And the specific nature of the change is going to determine how that then manifests. Okay? So it's important to understand how cell function is usually maintained, okay? What some of the parameters that are needed to maintain normal cell function, because there are going to be potential sources for malfunction, and that we'll then spend a lot of time throughout the semester talking about. So if we revisit our little cells, so all the cells in our body are being taken care of, so to speak, by the organization of the whole system. Right? And the way that we maintain cell health or cell function is by controlling the immediate environment these cells are exposed to. Okay? So our homeostatic systems can't alter intracellular function, but we can control extracellular fluid, which determines the environment of the cell. Okay? And that's an important place to start in terms of maintaining healthy cell function. So what are some of the important factors that are important in maintaining cell function, cell homeostasis? Cell stability. Okay. Number one, cells have to be able to control their volume. Okay. Cell swelling and cell shrinkage can have dramatic effects on cell function, okay, and can cause, in the extreme, can certainly cause cell death fairly easily. And so we have to control cell volume. And we do that by controlling water balance and osmolyte balance, which means that we control the level of solutes that can exert osmotic pressure. And we'll talk about how we do that. We control electrolyte balance. Okay? And electrolyte balance can greatly affect a cell's excitability. It can affect cells' membrane potential and whether or not we get the triggering of different reactions that are appropriate or not. Okay? So we affect electrolyte balance. We have to maintain adequate pH. And pH is usually maintained by the body within a fairly narrow range. Okay? So changes in pH are not tolerated. What happens when we get changes in pH? Who's affected most? Proteins, right? And so every enzyme in our body is a protein, and every reaction in our body is catalyzed by an enzyme. So pH is very, very tightly maintained. Cell metabolism. Okay? The cell has to be able to synthesize ATP and then utilize ATP. Okay? Cells don't last very long if they can't synthesize and hydrolyze ATP. And cell transport. The cell has to be able to regulate trafficking across its membrane. Okay. So let's talk about cell volume. Cell volume is maintained by maintaining water balance and osmolyte balance. So first off, extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid. It's an aqueous solution. It contains water, and it contains solutes. And many of those solutes cannot cross the plasma membrane. Okay? Solutes that can't cross the plasma membrane are osmolytes because they have the potential to exert osmotic pressure. And there are two components of intracellular and extracellular space that really are the primary osmolytes. They also happen to be important electrolytes, and that's our friends, the sodium and potassium. Okay? And so sodium is the major osmolyte of extracellular space, and potassium is the major osmolyte of intracellular space. Okay? So we maintain water balance and osmolyte balance by maintaining the amount of water inside and outside of the cell, by maintaining the amount of these osmolytes, especially sodium and potassium, inside and outside of the cell, and the relative concentration of water to osmolytes. Okay? Maintaining isotonic conditions at all times. Okay? And so the system that regulates water balance is slightly different than the system who's responsible for regulating sodium and potassium. Okay? So water is regulated systemically. Water balance is regulated systemically through our antidiuretic hormone thirst system. Okay? And this was, we learned this in the renal system last semester, that antidiuretic hormone does what at the level of the kidneys? Increases water reabsorption. Okay? Dust off that little area of the brain. Okay? So antidiuretic hormone, antidiuresis. Diuresis means the elimination of water. So antidiuretic hormone promotes water retention. Okay? Water alone, retention of water alone. Okay? The thirst system obviously increases, which controls the level of thirst that you have and therefore water that you consume. Okay? So water systemically, water balance is controlled by this ADH thirst system. Okay? So if your plasma osmolarity goes up, what happens to ADH? Does it go up or down? It's going to go up. Everybody agree? If plasma osmolarity gets higher, you're going to retain water in order to dilute that, okay, and bring plasma osmolarity back down. And you're also going to stimulate thirst in order to increase water consumption. Okay? So that's the system that controls water systemically. In terms of these osmolytes, sodium and potassium, they are controlled both systemically and intracellularly. And systemically, they are controlled by our friend, the Renin-Angiotensin system. Okay? And the Renin-Angiotensin system is controlled by volume status. Okay? So when blood volume goes up, that registers a rise in blood pressure. All right? And if you remember, our renal baroreceptors sense that when blood pressure goes up. And it releases what? Excuse me. Let's say blood pressure went down. That's what I meant to say. When volume goes down and blood pressure goes down, and the renal baroreceptors sense that, now what is it going to release? Renin. Thank you. Renin gets released. That stimulates the production of what? Angiotensin 1, which then gets converted to 2. Okay? And then angiotensin 2 leads to a rise in another hormone, aldosterone. Okay? And aldosterone, it's a long story, aldosterone causes the kidneys to conserve what? Sodium. And to waste what? Potassium. Okay? So this renin-angiotensin, sometimes it's called the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. Okay? It's controlled by blood volume and blood pressure. A drop in blood pressure causes a rise in everything. Okay? And a rise in blood pressure will cause everything to kind of go down. Renin goes down, angiotensin 2 goes down, aldosterone goes down. Okay? But the end result, this aldosterone, is going to control sodium and potassium balance. Aldosterone causes sodium retention and potassium loss. Okay? So that's how we control sodium and potassium levels systemically. Intracellularly, we control sodium and potassium levels through the ATPase pumps. Okay? So the cell, no matter what's going on systemically, the cell still has to be able to pump sodium out of the cell and pump potassium into the cell continuously. Okay? Even if systemic levels of sodium and potassium are normal, if the cell can't operate those pumps, eventually sodium will start to accumulate in the cell, which is really the most important effect. Sodium accumulates in the cell. And what do you think happens to cell volume when that happens? Is it going to increase or decrease? It increases. Okay? And so that's really the immediate threat when those pumps are disabled for one reason or another. Sodium accumulates in the cell and you get cell swelling. Okay? And in fact, it's often the first signs of cell death when that happens. Okay. So these water compartments, we have water balance and electrolyte balance being controlled. And the result is a balance of volume contained within the cell and outside of the cell. Okay. And we remember that ICF obviously was the fluid within the cell, ECF was the fluid outside of the cell, and then ECF is divided into two subcompartments, right? Intravascular space, what's in the plasma, and then interstitial space, what's in the interstitial fluid in the interstitial space. There's actually a third subcompartment of extracellular fluid. Does anybody know what that one's called? The third subcategory of extracellular space is actually called the transcellular compartment, or transcellular fluid. This is sometimes referred to as third space. Okay. Transcellular fluid is the fluid that lies between synovial membranes. Excuse me, not synovial, serous membranes. It's the fluid that sits between serous membranes. Can anybody give me an example of transcellular fluid? Somebody just said intrapleural fluid. Absolutely. Intrapleural fluid. Intracardial fluid. Intraperitoneal fluid. Synovial fluid. Okay. These are fluid spaces that sit between serous membranes. And they're it's a very, very tiny proportion when it's normal. It's a very, very tiny proportion of ECF, which is why it's normally not represented in drawings. But the thing about this third space fluid, is that the turnover of that fluid is not very rapid. Okay? And so when fluid accumulates in that space, it's not easy to get that fluid, to reabsorb that fluid and to remove it. Okay? And so in many pathological conditions, you might see third space fluid accumulation. Okay? And that often requires medical intervention in order to physically remove, okay? Because it's not easily reabsorbable. when we talk about intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid, if we add the fluid in both compartments, we get what's called total body water. Okay? All of the fluid that's contained within the body. And we're really mostly water. We're composed really mostly of water. 60% of our body weight is water. Okay? 60% of our body weight is water. 40% of that weight is in the intracellular space, and then 15% of that is in the interstitial, 5% is in the plasma, and then really a negligible amount is in that third space. Now, this percentage of body weight attributable to total body fluid, total body water, normally is 60%, but it can change depending primarily on percentage of body fat. Okay? Fat cells contain less water than all other cells. Okay? Fat cells contain less water than all other cells. So the higher a person's body fat percentage, the lower that number gets. Okay? The higher your body fat percentage, the less of your body weight is represented by total body water. Okay? And so that becomes significant when you're talking about someone with obese BMIs, where the body fat percentages are very high, or someone as they age. If you did nothing else, if you just maintained your current level of activity and your current diet, as you get older, 2 pounds a year of your lean body mass will be replaced by fat. That is the gift of aging. Okay? And as that happens, as your percentage of body fat changes as you get older, your percentage of body weight that is attributable to total body water goes down. Okay? And the reason why that is significant is because the lower that number gets, the more vulnerable you are to dehydration. So individuals that are obese, individuals that are elderly, these people are more vulnerable to dehydration for lots of different reasons, but this is an important one. And then between this ECF and this ICF, we know this already, there is a very different composition of the solutes that are dissolved in both of these compartments. Okay? Different composition. We talked about this in physiology. And the two components that we especially worry about is the sodium and potassium concentration differences between inside and outside, right? Not only because they are osmolytes and they will affect cell volume, but of course they're also our major electrolytes, and they're going to affect the cell membrane potential, the excitability of that cell, and how likely the changes in excitability are going to trigger intracellular reactions that are appropriate or not appropriate. Another factor that we worry about a lot in terms of cell function is the calcium level. Okay? If you notice, calcium levels intracellularly are extremely small. And this value is actually somewhat of a half-truth. Because what this number really means, this 0.0001 milliequivalents, is actually the level of free calcium in the cell. But we also have ways of storing calcium within the cell so that it's not free and can trigger reactions, but it's available for intracellular release when you need it. Okay? But changes in calcium intracellularly trigger reactions that trigger a whole range of reactions. It's one of these second messengers, if you remember, right? And if calcium levels change inappropriately, they can trigger reactions that are inappropriate and toxic to the cell. So calcium levels, when they rise, that can kill the cell fairly quickly. Okay, so we worry about calcium levels changing. Bicarbonate levels. Okay? Bicarbonate levels are going to affect the pH of the solutions, which again is going to affect protein structure and function, okay, and therefore catalytic function. So all of our important components of ECF and ICF all need to be maintained in order for cell function to be maintained. So what happens when things go wrong? Okay. When you have alterations in how fluid is distributed and how electrolytes are distributed. And you can talk about alterations in a couple of different ways. You can talk about the alteration in fluid distribution either between the subcompartments of ECF, interstitial versus plasma, or an alteration in fluid or electrolyte distribution between inside the cell and outside the cell. Okay. Now, when we're talking about alteration in distribution of fluid between interstitial space and intravascular space, one important example of that is edema. Okay. And we talked about it a little bit last semester, but it's important to sort of revisit edema and some of the causes of edema, because we're going to see lots of examples where edema is either an expected and useful part of the body's response to injury, and edema that's simply a pathological consequence of a disease state. So some causes of disease, causes of edema. And these are the common ones. Decreased plasma oncotic pressure. Okay? Decreased plasma oncotic pressure. This usually happens when you have losses or reductions in albumin. Okay? You remember albumin was our major plasma protein, was the most abundant plasma protein. Sometimes you will hear albumin described as the factor that maintains blood volume. Okay? That albumin is an important factor in just maintaining blood volume, because as soon as you have losses of albumin, you have shifting of fluid out of the vascular space. Right? Because osmotic or oncotic pressure is what kind of pressure? Is it pulling or pushing? Pulling. You have a 50-50 chance. It's a pulling pressure, right? Oncotic pressure, osmotic pressure, is a pulling pressure. And so plasma albumin maintains this constant pulling pressure that keeps fluid within the vascular space. So when albumin goes down, there's less of that pulling pressure and it leaks out. Okay? And you see this especially with liver disease, right? The albumin is produced by the liver. Liver function goes down, albumin levels go down. Okay? You see this especially in starvation states. Okay? People are starving, they're not eating enough protein, they're not producing albumin. They don't have enough amino acids to actually synthesize albumin. Okay? And if you know that big starvation belly or the liver cirrhosis belly, right? That belly, it's not fat, it's all fluid accumulation. And it's a type of edema that is a result of a fairly profound drop in plasma oncotic pressure. Okay? So that's a very, very important cause of edema. Another one which is sort of, it's the flip side of decreased plasma oncotic pressure sometimes, and that is increased interstitial oncotic pressure. Usually, do we usually have proteins in interstitial space? No. So usually interstitial oncotic pressure is nearly zero. It's negligible. Okay? Sometimes when you have vascular injury or you have the leaking of albumin out of the vasculature, now albumin occupies the interstitial space and it pulls water into that space. Okay? So we actually will talk about a context in which that's very, very expected and important, and that's during acute inflammation. Okay? If I scratch myself, which I do often, if I scratch myself within 20 seconds, I'll have this streak of inflammation, right? This streak of edema near the scratch. And that's because acute inflammation has caused all of the tiny little blood vessels, the little capillaries near that injury, to become very leaky and to leak out albumin, which draws water into the wound. Okay? And it's actually an adaptive process that's meant to sort of help flush out that wound. So we will talk about how, so that's an edema that's caused by increased interstitial oncotic pressure. And we'll talk more about that when we get to acute inflammation. Another cause of edema is increased capillary blood pressure. Okay. Increased capillary blood pressure was a pushing pressure in the capillary. Okay. And increased capillary blood pressure can be caused by hypertension. Right? So there's just an elevation in all of the arterial system, and that translates to capillary pressure. Okay. And it can also be caused by venous obstruction. Okay. So arteries feed capillaries, and then capillaries drain into veins. So if there's an obstruction in venous clearance, in the clearance of blood, that pressure is going to back up into the capillaries. Okay, and it's going to increase capillary blood pressure and cause edema because of that. Also, volume overload. A volume overload state acts very similarly to a venous obstruction, okay, where you just have more fluid throughout the entire system, and that elevates capillary blood pressure. Okay. And then finally, another cause of edema is lymphatic obstruction. Okay. And sometimes this is referred to as lymphedema. And lymphatic obstruction occurs when the vessels to an area, the lymphatic vessels to an area, the drainage of those vessels is obstructed. Okay. So if you remember, all the capillary beds have lymphatic drainage. And it's designed, the lymphatic drainage is designed to help regulate interstitial fluid by allowing for a route for this. If the volume in the interstitial space accumulates, it has somewhere to clear. It can get cleared through the lymphatic drainage. Okay? And it'll get cleared eventually. Right? Once you resolve the cause of an edema, it will clear eventually through mostly lymphatic drainage. Okay? But if someone has a lymphatic blockage, like let's say they've got a tumor in a lymph node that is preventing the drainage of that lymphatic vessel, or if the lymph node had to be removed for some reason, and so now you no longer have drainage through the area. So fluid that will accumulate in that part of the body will actually have a very difficult time getting cleared. Okay? And really the only way to treat true lymphedema is to prevent it from happening. Okay? And sometimes there's surgeries that can be done, but it's very difficult to clear that fluid once it accumulates there if you don't have lymphatic drainage to that region. Okay. So alterations in fluid movement or electrolyte and osmolyte movement between ICF and ECF. Okay. And another way of saying this is just fluid and electrolyte imbalances. Okay. These are examples of fluid and electrolyte imbalances. Fluid and electrolyte imbalances tend to come from alterations in sodium levels, alterations in chloride levels, and alterations in water levels, total fluid or water balance. And there are a lot of different ways that these fluid and electrolyte imbalances can be presented. Okay? There's a lot of different ways that you can talk about these fluid and electrolyte imbalances. You can specifically look at the different electrolytes and what happens when those values get elevated or decreased. Okay? You can look at changes in volume status, if somebody's volume overloaded or volume deficient. But one way, which is I think, an important way to think about these fluid and electrolyte imbalances is in terms of whether these imbalances are isotonic, hypotonic, or hypertonic. Okay? And what that tells you is, it doesn't really tell you anything about the volume state, but what it tells you is the relative concentration of water to these other solutes with these different alterations. Okay? So when we have isotonic alterations, okay, when we have isotonic alterations, it means that we have no change in our plasma osmolarity. Okay? With isotonic alterations, plasma osmolarity has stayed the same. But we do have a change in total body water. We do have a change in total plasma volume. Okay? But the change, whether it's a loss or a gain, is a proportional loss in both water and the solutes. Okay? It's an isotonic loss or gain. Okay? And isotonic volume depletion, classic example of that is hemorrhage, okay? Which means that we have lost whole blood, we have lost all of its components in proportional amounts. Okay? Severe wound drainage can be an example of isovolumetric depletion as well. Isovolumetric excesses, so volume expansion, that's isovolumetric. Excess IV fluid administration. Okay? And what class of etiology would we call that if somebody had that? That would be an iatrogenic, exactly. Or hypersecretion of aldosterone, okay? Where hypersecretion of aldosterone causes a conservation of sodium and a proportional conservation of water. So overall osmolarity is staying the same. Okay? So we have depletions and excesses that are isovolumetric. We can have hypertonic alterations. And this is where now plasma osmolarity or ECF osmolarity has gone up. It's now elevated for some reason. And oftentimes hypertonicity is either due to or accompanied by hypernatremia. So hypernatremia can be a cause and a consequence of a hypertonic alteration. Okay? And sometimes this happens when you have inadequate fluid intake. Okay? So you're not consuming enough water. And if you're not consuming enough water, the elevation in sodium is really just a consequence of the concentration of sodium in your blood. Okay? So your total body sodium is probably the same, but the amount of water you have is lower. Okay? So when you measure sodium concentration in a person's blood, it appears hypernatremic. Make sense? Inappropriate administration of hypertonic saline. There are situations where administration of hypertonic saline is appropriate, okay? And it is therapeutic. But if it's not well monitored or if it's given inappropriately, it can cause hypernatremia. Okay? A water deficit where someone is just not consuming enough water, that can actually cause either the same situation as we talked about with hypernatremia, right, where you're water deficit and then you're concentrating sodium. But water deficit can also be accompanied by sodium levels staying the same or sometimes going down. Okay. If you look at individuals who are exercising, not drinking enough water, and are sweating profusely. Okay. So these are, let's say, marathon runners or hikers that didn't bring enough water. Okay. What's going to happen to that person is that they are losing water, they're also losing salt. Okay. Sweat has salt. And so what you'll find is that they may actually be hypertonic, or they could end up being isotonic or even hypotonic, where their sodium levels are too low, depending on how much water and salt they've lost. Okay? And if you guys are, is anybody a marathon runner here? A wannabe runner, a couple of actual runners. Have you ever seen at races? I'm a wannabe too. I'll never do it. Have you ever seen at races where they're actually giving out salt pills? Yeah. So the most toxic effect of this dehydration through sweat and not enough water consumption is actually the hyponatremia that can occur. And that especially happens when you've got somebody who is sweating profusely and is only drinking water, right? So you're not replacing the sodium, you're actually only replacing the water. So water deficits, when it's accompanied by profuse sweating, can cause a hypertonic alteration, but it also can cause a hypotonic alteration and different changes in sodium levels. Okay. Inadequate renal conservation of water. Okay. If the kidneys are not, let's say the kidneys are not responding to aldosterone, not aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone. Okay. If the kidneys are not responding to antidiuretic hormone, or the body is not producing antidiuretic hormone, you're not conserving water, and your plasma osmolarity is going to get high very quickly. And sometimes these hypertonic alterations are caused by hyperchloremia, elevated chloride levels. And this sometimes can happen. Chloride tends to go in different directions based on sodium levels. Okay? It's sort of at the mercy of sodium. And so when you have excess sodium or deficits of bicarbonate, right? Chloride and bicarbonate also have an inverse relationship to each other. This can result in hyperchloremia. Or if you have somebody who has taken too much of a particular kind of diuretic that contains aluminum chloride, you can end up with hyperchloremia that causes a hypertonic alteration. And very quickly, these hypotonic alterations, hyponatremia, diuretics universally operate by blocking sodium reabsorption. Okay? Diuretics universally operate pretty much by blocking sodium reabsorption, with the exception of mannitol. That's the only one that doesn't. Okay? And so blocking sodium reabsorption means you are losing sodium, and sometimes if that is taken too far, it can cause hyponatremia. Vomiting can cause the loss of too much sodium. Diarrhea can cause the loss of too much sodium. Burns can cause the loss of interstitial fluid. And therefore sodium. There are cases of dilutional hyponatremia. We'll talk about that in a second. And dilutional hyponatremia, there is an expansion, generally speaking, there is an expansion of water content in the blood. Okay? And therefore, it dilutes the sodium that's present. That's what dilutional refers to. The excess intake of hyponatremia cause hypotonicity. Okay? There's a syndrome called SIADH, where ADH levels are abnormally high, which is going to cause inappropriate conservation of water, that's going to cause hypotonicity. And then the hypochloremia can cause hypotonicity. Okay. There is a condition that you'll read about actually in the required reading, and it's called hypertonic hyponatremia. Okay. Hypertonic hyponatremia. That refers to a condition where your blood tonicity, your blood osmolarity is elevated, but your sodium concentration in that blood is reduced. Okay. And it's a very particular situation. It's kind of unusual for those two things to be present. Okay, that for your blood to be hypertonic, but your sodium levels to be down. And that it usually occurs because you have an accumulation of some non-sodium osmolate. Okay. And the most common accumulations include blood glucose and cholesterol. So blood glucose levels get very high or cholesterol levels get very high. They increase the osmolarity of blood. And what does that do to blood volume? It increases, right? It increases the pulling pressure within that plasma, and therefore water gets shifted into the plasma compartment, and it dilutes the electrolyte levels. Okay. So the overall osmolarity of the blood is elevated because of this glucose or cholesterol, but the sodium content has been diluted because you've got more water in your bloodstream, okay? Or you got more volume in your bloodstream, but not a proportional rise in sodium. Make sense?